Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. So, there has been quite a bit going on in the Northeast for the last 2 months, especially in Manipur. I was constantly being emailed by regular listeners of the podcast that why are you not talking about it? Well, I take take time to discuss things because I like to sit back, look at everything, then formulate my views on a subject, and then go look for people who can speak very well. So now this month I will talk about it, and the first of such series of discussion is going to be with Rami Desai. Rami, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Kushal, thank you for having me on.
So, Rami, this is your first time on the podcast. So, I will request you to tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got into studying the Northeastern regions in general. I know we are talking Manipur, but your expertise is more in the Northeast in general.
Kushal, once again, thank you for having me on. And that question deserves like a really long answer because, it's taken me a long time to reach here. But I was always very interested in tribal communities for the sole reason that, and this, I mean, I was very interested means at the age of 10. I was very interested because I used to wonder why there was such a distinction and why all the conflict that I saw, all the tribal areas that I used to read about had so much of conflict, and also why there was so much of conversion amongst these tribes. And that led me to actually, as an undergraduate, study theology. So I studied theology, which brought me to, in my final year, two very, very interesting aspects of theology. So theology can be divinity studies and pure theology, which is very, very interesting. But, it also has other segments, which is Black theology or liberation theology. Liberation theology were the strategies and tactics that they used in places like Latin America, the colonialists, which was based on the poverty politics of it. And then Black theology was a theology that had entered Africa. And what were the strategies and tactics? And also what were the points of commonality, or how did they approach these very remote tribes with the religion of Christianity? And I studied this for my undergrad. I graduated in this. In my master's, I studied anthropology of religion, which really meant that I widened my scope of study a little bit. And that is when I started applying it to the Northeast region. The years that I was studying the Northeast, mind you, in the 90s, this was, considered extremely remote. We only saw the Northeast from the lens of, something alien, or, it was something inconceivable for us to travel there or to understand it. It just seemed very complex because it was so psychologically distant to us. And of course, it was geographically also distant, and connectivity was very bad. So, but there was no way to study the Northeast unless I went into the Northeast. So, about 15 years ago, I started traveling the Northeast. I started meeting with people, civil society, tribals, insurgent groups. I set up Northeast Policy Institute, which was a think tank in Guwahati in 2010. I started research, writing on all sorts of topics. And as I always say, this is a region, it's not a state. So it can take you a lifetime to understand it. It's very difficult to, ever say that I know this area fully or I'm an expert on this area, because it's just so complex. So that was my introduction to the Northeast. And I've done a couple of books, with Manipur University. And I have also looked at the role of anthropology and sociology, the social sciences, in looking at civilizations and tribal societies.
Fair enough. So Rami, for the benefit of the viewers who are going to watch this on YouTube and the ones who are listening to this later on Spotify or whatever audio platform they are on, can we start by summarizing why is Manipur burning for the last 2 months then?
Kushal, these are historical issues. There is no one way of looking at it or saying why is it burning. Give me a snapshot. These are legacy issues. So by legacy issues, I mean the issues that are vested in not just when the British came into these areas, the policies that they created, the identities that they created, their way of administration, their way of looking at all of this, which has given birth to the land issues that we have today. But also, it has something to do with the infiltration that is coming into the state, the perceived demographic change, the fact that the Meiteis feel threatened that they are limited to the valley, which is people say 10%, but if you remove a lot of the infrastructure, the Rohtak Lake, things like that, it's about less than 6%, wherein they are the majority of the population, but and they don't have scheduled tribe status, wherein the hill tribes that live in the hills and occupy 90% of the state land are smaller in population. Um, the genesis of this conflict we'll have to go into, deeper. But the present violence generally started with a high court order that said, the Meitei should be given a scheduled tribe, not be given. They've recommended it was a suggestion. So the High Court cannot decide on these matters, right? So they can only suggest to the state government, and the state government has to suggest it further. And there are multiple layers. But the High Court decided, based on a petition that was filed in 2013, that they recommend that the state recommend the Meitei community to be included in the scheduled tribe list. And therein began the conflict.
So, all right. So you mentioned there are historical reasons for this conflict, and okay, so let's get into the history. So the two aforementioned in quotes tribes in this are the Meiteis and the Cookies, right? If I'm getting it correctly. So, what is the history? So maybe we can start with the history of both the tribes. So, what is the history of both the tribes is very important to answer because I'm sure the conflict lies somewhere in the history itself.
So, okay, let me take it a little further. You know, the advent of the British was, a great impactful moment on the Northeast. Some people will want to look at it in terms of, they brought in the English language, they brought in the Christian religion, but also, you can look at it the other way around, that they brought in this skewed method of studying populations that were completely different to theirs. So in 1757 there was the Battle of Plassey. That's when the British set their sights on the northeast region, and at that point they saw it as really like the northeastern frontier. So they knew that the Chinese were across. They knew that this was strategically really important. This was not lost on them. They knew that this was very important in terms of tea trade. They knew that the routes were really important in terms of trade towards Myanmar. So this was really, really important, but these were really difficult terrains to come into because tribal populations lived along, the hills, and they were not, they had their own administrative systems. They had their own dealings with the Maharajas that were, around their areas, like the Maharaja of Assam or the Maharaja of Manipur, and they didn't appreciate any of this disruption. But however, because of the constant wars between Myanmar and Manipur at that time, Burma, there used to be constant wars between them. The Burmese were a formidable army, and they used to keep attacking the Manipuris, which at that time were the Meiteis. And there was also called the 7 years of devastation, where for 7 years the Myanmaris ruled Manipur. But tired of this, the Manipuris at some point asked the British for help, and history repeated itself because the British came in. Uh, there was a decisive victory in the first Manipur, Anglo Burmese War, and subsequently they became the protectorates of Manipur. Um, of course, there was a Maharaja, but the British were pretty much like running the state, and everybody kind of knew this. Now, what also happened at that point is that they would be confronted with constant raids, and these raids were not just by the Kukis, but it was very well known it was by the Nagas as well. They'd come down the hills when British companies would be going by and loot them or kill them, or not give them right of way. So British figured many things. So in Nagaland also they figured many ways to keep them in. But in Manipur, they figured that let us bring some Kuki populations and put them in the foothills. So maybe as buffer, maybe as protection, and this way, maybe we'll be able to mitigate some of the raids or some of the confrontations. Now, that is one history, right? Like, that's one history as to why they were brought in. Now, we must remember that these tribes are contiguous to a lot of the border areas across the border. So, you have the same tribes who will be in Myanmar, you have the same tribes that will be in Mizoram. Let me also clarify this that Kuki is an umbrella term, like Naga is an umbrella term. These terminologies came much, much later. There are sub tribes. So the Nagas are 16 plus sub tribes. So there'll be Ao, or there'll be Angami, or Tangkol. There'll be tribes like this. So under the Kukis also, there are the Mas, the Petis, Um, so there are sub tribes. So all these little groups of tribes come under a larger umbrella called the Chin Kuki tribes, which basically they're bound by some level of common language. The languages may not be exact, but some level of common language. So, giving that background, obviously the Kuki side says that they've been here forever, um, and the Meiteis and the British records say that they were brought in, and that is the history of the Kukis and the Meiteis being here. Having said that, it's really, really well known that the Meitei kingdom, has expanded, has decreased many times over. And when the British were in Manipur as well, it was not just the valley that they were ruling. They were ruling, lands far beyond that as well. Of course, they brought in a lot of rules and regulations to keep hill tribes away, and that became a point of sort of discontent. Eventually that became the reason of very, very sort of cemented identities. So for example, the British had policies of exclusion and isolation. So all the hill tribes that bothered them, you know they marked them as excluded areas. So excluded areas means that they're excluded from the reach of any sort of administration, British administration, development, any sort of equal sort of reforms that are coming into the rest of the country. They also brought in what is called the ILP, which I'm sure all of us are very familiar with, the inner line permits. There was an outer line also, there was a middle area also. The middle area, they only had they only had sort of political dominance over, but the inner line beyond that, you could not go in. So the British decided who went in and who didn't. So for many years, even post independence, at least in Nagaland and all, um, there was a hesitancy to go in because you needed a permit. You couldn't just enter Nagaland. So, across the Northeast, these kind of laws of exclusion, isolation were brought in post independence also. Um, they continued, and this created these huge divisions.
But then, going by what you're saying, I mean, how many cookies were present in Manipur in, let's say, 1900s? Well, not a lot, right?
No, no, not a lot. They say that from that point, uh, you know, from being a small population, they increased to about, I think, 14% in 1999, and they say 16% later, But of course, the question is not of the population, of the cookies per se. The question that in this situation that plays a role is illegal infiltration. Now, those are not going to be counted, right? And there seems to be large numbers of infiltration coming in that is settling in not just tribal areas, but also protected forest areas, which, is beyond the valley. And that seems to be the problem of the demographic change.
All right, got it, got it. So then you talk about demography and the demographic change. Now when we talk about demographic change, is this at a ethnic level, as in the level of the jati or the tribe, whatever word we want to use, or are we talking about at the level of the religion itself?
I would look at this situation simply in terms of, um, a conflict that is based on land rights, the demography based on infiltration. So I wouldn't really put a religious lens on it. Of course, we are well aware that the existing cookies in Manipur are majority Christian. There are, of course, Jewish. There's a little small Jewish community also amongst the cookies. Amongst the Meiteis, there are Meitei Muslims, there are Meitei Christians, there are Meitei revivalists, there are Meitei Hindus. Wherein when we talk about this clash, we talk about it in terms of Meitei versus cookies. So I wouldn't necessarily put a religious lens on it. More so, I would put an ethnic lens if I had to.
But then when did the cookies get Christianized? Like, who Christianized them? They clearly weren't Christians in the early 1900s, right? There was a period of their Christianization, right?
So Christianization in this entire region has been a very, very how do I put it? It's been a very pre-planned thing. It didn't happen, it didn't happen out of some amount of, I don't know, spiritual experience. Because the way I look at it, spiritual experience, happens rarely, and it has to be very deep-seated, and that is what, commands some sort of uh, change of religion. If you look at it, and I have to say here that I've studied um, the Naga insurgency and its, and its parameters in accordance to religious conversion far more closely than the Manipuris, but it applies across the region. When the British came in, again, one of the reasons was that they could not control these tribes. They were fierce tribes, they were very independent, they were rebellious, um, they didn't want to have anything to do with the British. If you also recall in Manipuri history, the Cookies fought the British for almost 2 years. Um, so they were very unwelcoming of the British. The British tried this way, they tried that way to enter these areas. They couldn't. One of the also very important reasons for them to enter these areas was that the route that they used to go into Manipur went through, close to the Naga hills. And the tribes would come down and attack them. Even in Manipur, tribes would come down from the Naga hills and attack them. So this would keep happening. And there was murder and there was, bloodshed. So the British decided that we have to do something. There's a very interesting letter that I found that I often quote because that sort of encapsulates their intention, which was by one of the political agents who was posted in the Northeast to the secretary of the government in England. And he basically wrote to the secretary, who's a very important man, and said that, look, we are making a mistake in India by trying to convert um, the upper middle classes, because they are really rooted in their religion. So, what we should be doing is we should be trying to actually convert these people that we found in the Northeast because they are so nascent in their idea of nationhood. and that they're so uncivilized that we will be doing moral good and by introducing them to Christianity. Now there was a lot of, Vishal, you have to understand, it wasn't like the British just came in and there was no opposition to them. There was a lot of opposition in Europe to colonization. They didn't really appreciate the government. There were groups of people that didn't appreciate the government colonizing these countries, because they said, why do you want to interfere with their local traditions, religions? People thought that they were disruptive. And so the British also, you will be surprised, took expositions of tribals from across the world, um, in their very, in their very raw self, in cages for expositions around Europe to show them off. There were many African tribals, there were tribals from all over, all the countries that they had conquered, in places like Paris and London, to show them off to the common man. So the common man would come and see them as animals in a zoo, and to show them off so that they could get some sort of, some sort of support for what they were doing in these countries. So, they'd showcase them and they'd say, look at them, they're so uncivilized. The words that were very often used was uncivilized, savages, and pagans. Today, it is our mistake, and it is problematic that we self-describe ourselves as pagans, because it has very, very detrimental connotations and consequences for us. But this is how they described us. And, and they won public support. So coming back to my story of this gentleman, this political agent who wrote a letter to the Secretary of Government, to the government in England, in London, the secretary replied back saying, "Look, we can't, we can't give you money to have missionaries in, because the public might object to it. So what we'll do is we'll give you money to set up schools, and in those schools you can hire missionaries as teachers." So that's what they did, and that's how we have the missionary schools that we do in the Northeast. Over and above that, what they did is they started introducing language. Now, like I said, a lot of the sub-tribes, we obviously now use these umbrella terms. For example, Naga. Naga is an umbrella term. Nobody self-identified themselves as a Naga for a really long time. Till very recently, I know, I know I have Naga friends who say that, like, our grandparents don't understand the term Naga, but they never self identified themselves as Nagas. They were all different tribes with different languages, or, yes, sometimes even interwarring. And as you know, that even in Manipur, we had these Naga tribes, same with the Kukis, it was a Kuki is a general label. So they started introducing languages and they started teaching not just English, but they've created their own language as well, Nagamese, which takes Assamese and local languages and things like that. And the first book that they handed all of these tribals, and this is the same strategy across the Northeast, all of these tribals, was the Bible. So the first books that they started reading was the Bible. There's a very interesting one of the diaries of Mary E. Clark, first, one of the first missionaries that went into the Naga Hills. The reason I bring in the Naga Hills is because it happened before, the Cookies. This was their first advent into conversion after Meghalaya. So they went into the Naga Hills. They had a gentleman called Gothula Brown. He was, I think, the first Assamese convert who took them in, built some relationship with the outright. And it was Mary Clark's husband who was the missionary, but she's the one who wrote the diary. And there were little things like there was a wild animal that kept attacking the village, and nobody could get control of the animal. And the doctor, Mary Clark's husband, Dr. Clark gave a injection, and the animal died. And the villagers, because they were so innocent, they said, "Oh my God, this is the hand of God. So whatever you say must be the truth." and he got his first bunch of followers, you know. So it was very innocent way of entering. But let me also tell you that it took a lot of time for them to convert. So it wasn't like they came in and within the first 3 months they converted a bunch of people anywhere. You know, it took them decades and decades and decades, and it was really tough. But if you look at the ratios, you will find some of the majority of the conversions have happened post independence during the times of conflict, you know. And one of the reasons for that, in my opinion, is also a lot of forced conversions, a lot of gunpoint conversions. We still today see this happen in places like Arunachal, you know, where there is some sort of threat perception of insurgent groups. We've also seen a huge jump in conversion. So in 1901, where there would have been 0. I think 4 or 5% or 7% conversion in Arunachal. Today they say it's 40%, and if the census was ready to come out and everybody was ready to be included who's converted, it would be as much as 60%. So, you know, as much as we can say the British brought the missionaries in, the British had an agenda to convert these areas, to convert tribal communities. We also have to accept that majority of the conversions happened post independence.
So then, can we blame Nehru? It's-
Actually, you can, because Nehru's tribal affairs advisor, mind you, was Barrier Elven, who was a white missionary. You know,
yeah.
so you know, it's terrible in terms of I have always had a problem with the Western lens of looking at ancient civilizations like ours. You know, so if you have somebody like Barrier Elven, he can later on in his life go and say that I'm a Hindu, I'm not a Hindu, but you're classically educated in colonial subjects. So subjects like anthropology, sociology, these were subjects of the civil services examinations. So they were taught these subjects because it was important that they went in when they went into new territories, they could first do an anthropological, sociological study of the communities before they made their advent into these areas. So there were at that point, Kushal, there were great scholars like Guriev, the head of Bombay School of Sociology, who uh, argued and debated with Barrier Elvin, because Barrier Elvin wanted isolation and exclusion for tribal communities even post independence, on the basis of the fact that they have uh, they have a very special cultural and traditional way of life, and we must preserve it. Um, Whereas Gurrier said that, you know, A, that's going to be terrible for our country because we are at this point of integration, and you're going to keep a complete, you know, you're going to keep complete communities of people out of the development processes that they deserve equally as everybody else. Number two, we have lived side by side with different ways of life for as long as we can remember. There have been connections in the past, there have been ancient literature connections, there have been ancient historical connections. In Harshvardhan's court, the king of the Maharaja of Kamrup, Bhaskar Varman, used to travel so often. He met Huan Seng in Harshvardhan's court, and he invited him to Assam. And some of actually the history that we know of the Northeast, we know from Huan Seng's eyes, you know. But I'm saying there was this kind of connection. There's also ancient historical connection where Parshuram Kund lies in Arunachal Pradesh, where one of the major tribes in Arunachal Pradesh say that they are descendants of Rukmani. You have the Meiteis, who, you know, or tribes in Manipur as well, who say, oh, you know, Chitrangada came from here and this was her kingdom. Hidimba, Dimapur, they say, comes from her name. You know, so there was all this connectivity which kind of was like cut off. And Gurria's argument was that that should not happen. There should be reminders of this sort of ancient connectivity. There should be reminders of uh, how we have lived side by side, and that can only happen if you don't have these rules and regulations that exclude them. Number two, the development process would be very unequal. So other areas would be developed and tribal communities would not be, and this is what we are dealing with today. Number three, as we know, a lot of us know that missionaries were allowed in, others weren't. So it wasn't a level playing field. So obviously, there are questions that without any doubt can be raised on Nehru and Nehru's policies, but also Nehru's idea. In a way, I feel he was so Western educated, his lens was so Western, and he possibly wanted to identify himself as a Western man, that even his lens of how he looked at tribal communities was from an anthropological perspective, which was a Western perspective, which was a perspective of we are looking at these communities as the other, not as us. So there was this whole sense of otherhood that was created between tribal communities and the rest of India. Over and above that, they were so bad at cartography. If you look at how the Northeast is connected through that chicken's neck, you know, uh, it's just, it's awfully imagined because the widest width of that road is 22 kilometers. So not only does that make it psychologically distant, but that also brings in a lot of hugely important security issues for us.
So you're saying Nehru had an etic view, not an emic view.
I don't think Nehru knows what view he had, right? In all honesty, I don't think so. Sometimes if you read his book, sometimes he says, I'm a pagan, but I'm a Hindu, but I subscribe to the pagan way of life. But I don't think anybody, he knew what he was saying. At other times he says that, these are exquisite people, that, we should preserve them. This is, I
Oh,
mean,
so they're museum pieces too now. Oh, how
you
nice.
know that for the British it's always been that, and I would believe for Nehru also it would be the same thing. He had very Elven, he agreed to isolation and exclusion policies. you know how do we undermine the intelligence of tribal communities in not being able to self-determine their own future? I mean, India is full of communities that have really exclusive cultural practices, traditional practices, um, who are geographically limited to certain areas. uh, they've all they've all been mainstreamed, and they've managed to preserve whatever their identities were, in terms of their culture, their traditions. Who are we to undermine the decision taking ability of a tribal community, that we feel that we are the owners, that we should give them all these protective layers? And what is the gamble that we've taken? What is the consequences of this? You see, it has national security issues that are attached to it, because you've left this region which is so strategically important that the British had figured out at that point. Let me also tell you, Kushal, when the British were leaving, they were running out of money. They spent huge, vast amount of money. Also, let me, on a different note, tell you that the most expensive war that they ever fought in the history of British colonization anywhere in the world was the Anglo-Burmese War from Manipur, which uh, which at that point they say they spent about $5 million or whatever, but they say it goes into billions if it was today. So anyway, so
Wow.
point being that the British were leaving, they were leaving India, but they still had a plan. Alexander Mackenzie once said that the Northeast was our manifest destiny, and that we would not rest until every tribe, every people, every community in the region was governed by us. And while they were leaving, they wanted to make this manifest destiny come true in terms of they wanted to keep the Northeast as a crown colony. So they'd leave India, yet they'd have exclusive rights on the Northeast, and that would be a crown colony. So they would govern over the Northeast. However, things were so bad for them by then, financially and politically, that they couldn't afford to do so, luckily for us. And why would the British want to have a crown colony? Because A, they realized it was a great natural frontier. It was really rich in resources. The British were always looking towards resources. So one of the reasons that they also brought in these protected forest areas, which disrupted the tribal way of life, let me tell you, was not to protect forests. It was because their usage of timber was increasing, because they were
Hmm.
shipbuilding at such a fast rate that they needed the timber, and the timber was going to come from these areas and Myanmar. That was the best timber that they could get their hands on. So also they protected not just northeastern forests, but forests across the country where they faced rebellions, because this is what tribal communities depended on, not just for their sustenance, but also there was a lot of spiritual experience attached to these forests that they considered divine in many places of India. So the British knew this. The British also knew that if they converted this into a Christian region, they had a base, and this base could be countered to use, against China or against trade wars, and it was just in Southeast Asia. It was just a very, very exclusive area to have, and we've seen later on they've done the same with South Korea. They've done the same with East Timor. So this wasn't a new idea. This was a really, really, we knew that this was a crucial area. Yet when Nehru came in, he chose the policy of non-interference. Let's not give it infrastructure, let's not give it this, let's not change British laws, 150-year-old laws, let's just continue with them. I don't think he understood the politics, the dynamics, and um, the demands of the Northeastern people very well. But beyond that, there wasn't political will either. And it's shocking for me that the British clearly indicated to you how important these areas were, and you chose to ignore it. Today, however, through the Actis policy and things like that, it's become a part of our mainstream consciousness that we realize how
Yeah.
important it is to us. But for a long time, when I was growing up, I'm sorry to say, and I'm sure all my Northeastern brothers and sisters would agree, that they felt like they were othered. And I
Yeah.
think that is a shame to, you know, for a civilization like ours that is so ancient and that has lived side by side with all these communities forever.
Yeah, I think in Nehru's case, you can make it the classic case of the bigotry of low expectations in a reverse or on a steroids version. Nehru had Nehru never cared for these people. I mean, I'm nobody who hides his affiliations. I've never been a fan of the Congress style of model or model of governances, because it is very condescending to minorities or to the other, whatever the other is. And on the pagan word, I look at it like this: no matter what the history of the pagan word is, I think I own the pagan tag, just like African Americans and Africans owned now the N word, is because yes, it was used as a slur against the pagan, but I own it now and I'll use it now, and I'll remind you why you used it then. And to me, it is very important that we always have the pagan world in our linguistic arsenal, in my personal view, and I'm not abandoning it, is simply because I want to remind. And just like that, I say this, my friend Harsh Madhusudan Gupta also says this, that they're trying to do the same with the Hindutva word, and we should own Hindutva as a word too, because they are doing the same thing. The strategy is very standard. You use a word and you keep disowning it, maligning it, just like the Christians or the Abrahamic religions did with the word pagan. Um, it happened with the African community and the N word. Now today, because of the rise of India, and the change of the politics in India, it is about Hindutva, and everybody should own these words, which is why I have barely any agreement with the Hindutva side on most issues. They're socialists, I'm not. Most of the things they promote, I don't agree with, but I still own the Hindutva tag for these very reasons, and I think the pagan word should be owned up by everybody. Deep down inside over here is also a conflicting situation, as in, people will say, oh, these were unique people. I mean, unique in what sense? I like the fact that you mentioned there were ancient artifacts there, because a lot of times people start saying things like, oh, they are not Hindu. Like the term Hindu itself, what is the origin of the word? What are the modern day connotations of the word Hindu? In that sense, was there Hindu in the modern sense in the past? I mean, Diana Egg talks about a sacred geography where there was something that that kind of united people from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, or way beyond Kashmir too. And what was that sacred geography? But we are talking about this particular conflict now. What what has this conflict now? The problem is, somebody says, like, I sound very very conspiratorial here, but जैसे पाकिस्तान में हर टाइम होता है ना, तो लोग बोलते हैं रा की साजिश है, ये रा की साजिश. Pakistanis have the standard line for everything is रा की साजिश. But how much of a role has Burma, China? Nobody wants to talk about the role of China in this. And uh, and and uh, and maybe other nations are involved in kind of propping up this conflict from our
Okay.
national security perspective.
Okay. So you made a couple of points, and as we are not really short on time, let me address point by point. I've had this conversation with Harsh as well on paganism, but I have very strong views on paganism because, in my opinion, paganism was only and only in reference to an um, the Roman Empire boundary. So it wasn't a question of rural, non-rural. It was only in reference to the Christian community and in reference to the Roman Empire boundary that they were converting over and over again. Um, Herbert Hope Risley, who really created a lot of foundations for us, which now a lot of times we negate. Also, he has an interesting exposition on paganism. He did a comparative study between actually what paganism was and what Hinduism was. And he said one of the biggest difference is that there was no spiritual quality because they didn't follow, there wasn't a spiritual existence to what we call pagans today. Whereas if you go to a common man, and this is what he's written, if you go to a common man in India, the most average, illiterate, uneducated, poor person, and if you were to ask him to talk about some more elevated ideas like life or death, he'd be able to do so with a great amount of spiritual sounding. This is what he's written. So which uh, indicates a certain difference of not just theological but spiritual um, superiority to what paganism was. And therein comes my issue with the word paganism, that it's applied to us by maybe somebody else, but wrongly so. But it's also applied to us from a missionary lens. The minute you self claim as a pagan, uh, there's literally like a target point that they find, and you won't convert, or the third person won't convert. But somebody who's remote, in remote areas, impressionable, like we've seen in the Northeast, would, because you're saying you're not superior, I'm superior. Wherein the fact is, even if you were to look at tribal communities, the superiority of their administrative systems, the superiority of their spiritual systems, is something that we haven't even begun to delve into. We never talk about it. So that is my take on paganism. And of course, we can have different points of view on that. Your second point was unique people. Absolutely. This idea that we'll decide that you're unique, and unique not in the way that, we are elevating your status. So we are calling you unique because, we think you're really smart. But we're calling you unique because we think you need to be saved by us. And this is absolutely, I think, um, you know, this is uh, this is absolutely condescending, because I think that everybody needs to be given that credit to have a place on the table, which I think tribal communities were not given by them. But your third point, which now goes off to the role of Myanmar and international agencies. Um, you see, the problem with the Northeast is that it has huge borders. So it has over 1,600 kilometers of land border. These borders are not easy to plug. They are highly forested. There's huge amount of difficult terrain. Um, Fencing is only as strong as your weakest point in the fence, and that is not going to help. But also, we have a historical problem with these borders. Is again the way we've mapped it out. We have contiguous tribes across the border as well in Myanmar. Um, you could call them cousins of the tribes that live in some parts of the northeast. Now, what happens with that is that demands some level of loyalty, and that gives you a base. Historically, insurgencies in the northeast have been given shape across the border. So if it was Tripura, NLFT was trained by ISI in Bangladesh, um, and that's where they used to train from and come into Tripura. Um, if we were to talk about NSC and the longest running insurgency in this country, it got its training in China. It got some amount of ideological support in China. Um, it used the it used the pathways of Myanmar to reach China. So the leadership of NSCN actually trekked all the way to China. The reason it got support is because it had cousin tribes on the other side who themselves were fighting insurgencies against the Myanmarese government. So this has always been the case. We also know this not just because we know that they were trained there, but we also know the weapons that they use. You know, a lot of the weapons are Chinese made. So this will always be a threat for us. And now what has happened is that after the Tatmadaw has come in, they've cracked down on a lot of the Chin Kuki groups as well, amongst other groups, insurgent groups in Myanmar. And there's been a bit of an exodus. That exodus has just not been in Manipur, but it's in Mizoram as well. And it's an umbrella term called zone nationalism, which includes Kuki Chin tribes. And Mizoram also has commonalities with these tribes. They're all under the same group. In Mizoram, however, there has been some amount of registration of the people who are coming in. So there's been about 30,000 refugee registrations. In Manipur, there has been none. So, that brings up the question of uh, why has there been no registration? Why don't we know who these people are? Why are they not identified? How do we know that these are not trained militants that are coming in? How do we know? We already know that there is poppy cultivation. Um, we know that derivatives of this sort of cultivation lead to heroin. We know that one of the biggest problems that states like Manipur and Mizoram deal with and have dealt with is a drug problem amongst its youth, is the high rates of HIV. So why should it not be a concern? Why should infiltration not be a concern? Now they say that there's a 16-kilometer area this side of the border, that side of the border, where you can come in, do trade, you can go out. That is perfectly all right because that has to happen in, again, cultures, civilizations, traditions, tribes that are so old. You can't just demarcate them like that. You have to give them some amount of leeway. That's fine. But if there's settlement, and if there is a demographic change, if there is illegal activity that they are involved in, then it's a matter of concern because we have historical basis to believe that insurgency can take some shape or form with the help of our unstable neighbors. Now, for example, if you look at Myanmar has also taken out a notification for the Myanmari citizens that are presumably in Manipur, which says that uh, please do not cause any disharmony amongst your host population. Please do not indulge in poppy cultivation or any other illegal activity. Please do not indulge in any sort of militancy, otherwise, there will be consequences. Now, why has this happened? People will say that this doesn't solve your problem, right? Yes, it doesn't solve the conflict problem. But there was a point when the Tatmadaw came, took over, where a lot of us said, oh my God, we must push for democracy, we must bring in the democratic station back into Myanmar. It's not our job. What our job is to keep our neighborhood first, in line with our neighborhood first policy, to keep good relations so that at times like this, we can get some amount of support from them. Also, if we don't get support from these states, Kushal, 40% of the debt of Myanmar is owed to China. Where is Myanmar going to turn to? It's going to turn to China, which poses a bigger problem for us. So it's very important to have good relations with, especially neighborhoods that are difficult. And unfortunately, we are in such a precarious position that all our neighborhoods are difficult. So you see, Bangladesh, there's a huge threat of Bangladesh if it ever becomes radical, if there's ever a change of dispensation. Again, the chances of insurgent activity might increase because we've already seen that happen with NLFT. It can have multiple levels of impact. With Myanmar, if we don't keep good relations, and if we don't at least play a neutral role, the chances are that it will lean more towards China. We've already seen China's advent, not just in Myanmar in terms of businesses and industries, but we've also seen the takeover of Coco Islands, which is 55 kilometers away from the Andamans. And this kind of tells us their movement. Also, again, we've had NSCN train with them. So these countries and our neighborhood plays a huge role. We have to keep good relations with whatever the government there is. We have to keep ourselves in mind, and it's very important for us to keep the northeast region very safe and secure and prevent this sort of situation like what has happened in Manipur from happening, because it jeopardizes our Act East policy. And that is a huge centrality of the government. It's a central policy of our government because it plays a stabilizing role. It doesn't even play a stabilizing role just in the northeast, but it would play a stabilizing role, and a connecting role right up to Southeast Asia.
Okay, so one major thing that I wanted to ask you about was this 2008 suspension of the operations agreement between insurgent groups and the government of India. Now, who do you think, in your opinion, were the major, beneficiaries or benefactors of that 2008 SOO? I mean, a lot of people. I mean, I've seen pictures, and I'm sure you are aware of that. I mean, there are private armies in certain areas, and then there are the Assam Rifles also. So, and do you think the Assam Rifles have held their head high in this entire process too?
So, with the Sioux operations, it took 8 years for the O.B. Singh government to negotiate these operations. The beneficiaries obviously was the state of Manipur, because without a doubt, it is of great benefit to any community if militant groups are laying down their weapons. And this is what happened. They laid down their weapons, they surrendered their weapons with the clause that they would not take in more recruits. However, from the information that I have, there have been more recruits, and that is a breach of the agreement. Also, if you were to ask me personally, um, obviously I was not on the negotiating table, and I'm sure people who are negotiating these terms and conditions have a tougher time than we would imagine. One key would be with the insurgents, the militants, and the other key would be with our forces, where the weapons were kept, the armory. Uh, we've seen this time round that these weapons have been looted, and I don't know how good a decision it is to have any sort of these sort of assault weapons, these heavy duty weapons floating around in the country, no matter, or in the state, no matter where they are. Because if violence like this breaks off, you have access to them. Now there are 4,000 weapons floating around. I think about 1,500 have been surrendered. But even 3,500 weapons. Now, these kind of weapons are not going to go in your hand, my hand, or the friends I have amongst the Kuki community or the friends I have amongst the Meitei community. These people, or we would consider ourselves rational, we would consider it dangerous to arm ourselves with these weapons. Having said that, whose hands are they going to? They'll be the miscreants. They'll be, people trying to gain a pound of flesh, somebody who's not scared of the law, and that becomes really dangerous. So I think, this is a bit of a difficult negotiation to do. So there's nothing good or bad about it. Of course, they surrendered. Their complaint is that to come to the fulfillment of all their uh, agreement points, it's taken too long. It's still sort of hanging in the air. But that's the way these things work. We've seen this with the Naga agreement, also the NSCN agreement, the first agreement that the government of India signed when it came into power in 2014 was the agreement with NSC and IM, which is the Naga-based Manipur group, Isaac Muiva's group. The other being Kaflang's group, which was functioning out of Myanmar. But that agreement also right now is taking a long time to come to some fruition. So these things take a long time. It takes leadership on the end of the militants as well to come to some sort of dialogue which has something concrete that comes out of it. See, you cannot be stuck, and this is how I look at it. You can't be stuck on your demands to the point that it remains a stalemate. You have to cede space to come to some amount of conclusion. And if that doesn't happen, then leadership gets old, leadership dies, doesn't have power. What are you going to negotiate? And it's going to keep your people also in a limbo. So, yeah, and the other problem with the Sioux operations was also that the 14 Sioux camps, again, this is my opinion, surrounded the valley. Now, if these camps are surrounding the valley, there is some amount of threat perception that the people of the valley are going to feel. So that it's problematic, it's not easy to solve, but I wouldn't really cast any doubt on our security forces there are huge amount of limitations. For example, sealing the border. you know our security forces cannot do it just by manning it. This is over 1600 kilometers of border. So these are very difficult situations to comment on, easy to comment from the outside, difficult to really play it out.
But don't you think the government has to be criticized? I don't care which government. I've never hidden my voting options and voting patterns on this podcast. Everybody who listens to this podcast knows I'm a BJP voter. I always state it upfront as a person who is talking to people, but it doesn't matter. Don't you think the government has to be criticized about the way it has handled this? Is even the current conflict? Like, so I'll give you an example. So what I did was I went on social media, I went on Google and other search engines. I typed cookie, and I get a version, right? Then I go to center left to Marxists, and I type Christian evangelization in the Northeast. Complete negationism, complete denialism of anything to do with Christian evangelical. Then I type mighty, and I type mighty plus Indian right wing. Okay, complete doomsday scenario. Every mighty is going to be murdered. This is Kashmiri Pandit version happening in India. The Indian government is useless. The Indian government is incapable of anything. I'm literally telling you what happens on social media. Now, I understand the algorithm only pushes doomsday scenarios. So, whether it's doomsday of the left, doomsday of the right, basically at the end of the day, doomsday wins. But the point is, what is the reality? Where do we hold the government accountable? Why aren't we talking about these things? Like every time when the blockade happens, there are only certain areas that are blockaded, not all areas that are blockaded. I'm talking about the economic blockades. Aren't these realities? And and if you go to the cookies, they'll say, oh, we are being ethnically cleansed. You go to the mighties say they are being ethnically cleansed. Now I might lean towards the mighty case more than the cookie case, But that's my personal view. I don't care. I could be wrong, and I will correct myself the moment somebody provides me with better information. But why isn't anybody questioning the government of the day?
So this is a very complex situation. These are not problems that have come up today. The Kukis and Meiteis, the Nagas, the Kukis and the subtribe Paitis have had clashes, massive clashes in 1997, 1993, massive clashes between the Kukis and the Nagas. This is not per se has anything to do with the government. This is inter-tribal rivalry, inter-ethnic rivalry. And this is a legacy issue, like I said in the beginning. This is nothing new. It has happened historically, it continues to happen. Now, let us come to it piece by piece. Uh, yes, you will find a lot of polarization. I've often said this in a lot of my debates that if I was to close my eyes and hear people speaking, I'd know who's a Kuki, who's a Meitei, because I know exactly, what, points of confidence they'll come with. But having said that, that is going to happen because the communities itself have been historical rivals. Even the land issue, right, is not a new thing. The ethnic rivalry is not a new thing. There's a superiority, inferiority, victim card, all sorts of complexes that are involved in this also. And, uh, to be able to put it in some amount of logic, we have to look at it from what started this conflict out. It was a recommendation of the High Court to the state government saying that the Meitei should be recommended as a tribe. Now, any tribe or any people that are involved in this dialogue will know that this is a very long process. That just by a recommendation, the state cannot decide by itself. It will go to NCST, it will go to TRI, people will give their recommendations, then it'll go to the government, and then so on and so forth. They will decide. Now, what is the basis of this conflict? Is the basis a new conflict? Is the basis a new base? Is the foundation new? No, it isn't. It's historical. They've been fighting over, there's been arguments about this for as long as I can remember. And if you want to look at it from that point of view, yes, the Meiteis do have a very strong foundation to demand for a scheduled tribe status. All right, so this was not something that came out of the blue. This was not something that hasn't happened before. Yes, the Kukis and the Meiteis have never fought before, but has the rivalry existed? Yes, it has. So, for example, I met a bunch of a very intelligent bunch of Meiteis, and I met a very intelligent bunch of Kukis. And one of the things the Kukis said to me is that, oh, we were, historically we were called Haitus by the Meiteis, if I'm pronouncing that right, which basically means like, you know, smelly people. So there's been this sort of like, this sort of superiority complex as well. On the other hand, the Kukis are adamant on the fact that the Meitei should not get scheduled tribe status, and there is no reasonable argument behind it, is what I found, and that is my personal, opinion. If 54% of your population is staying in less than 6% of the land mass, do you understand what is going to happen in the next 20 years? This is going to be a, a ghetto like situation to live in. There is going to be complete abuse of resources, and there's going to be an implosion. It cannot go on like this. Now, out of the 90% of the area that the Kukis have, and they'll disagree with me, in terms of they don't want to cede an inch of space, but the 90% land that they have, out of which majority of the land is not habited. So if it's not habited, then why not share it? Because eventually, Kushal, what is going to happen? You want development, you want infrastructure, you want all of these things to come in. But with that, migration also comes in. You will need space for the migrant workers who will come in. You'll need space for the infrastructure that you need to develop. You need space for the growing population that you have. And this sort of hardened lines is what the problem is. Now, when it comes to what the government should have done, what the state government has done, not done, there can be many points of view on this. But let me tell you, all situations that have happened in the Northeast largely have taken a very long time to resolve, because there is huge amount of emotions attached to any of these conflicts that have happened. There is huge amount of connectivity to their land, so any sort of compromise on territorial integrity, either way, creates a huge furor. Also, it's very difficult to find uh, voices that are consolidated from any of these tribes. So, for example, um, what does it mean by a scheduled tribe? Why are the Meiteis asking for a scheduled tribe? Because it gives you privileges. What are the privileges it gives you? The scheduled tribes have the tribal communities in Manipur have autonomous district councils. They have hill autonomous district councils, so they can do a lot of their own decision making. A lot of power is vested in these councils. I do know that they want further powers, but there's exemption of tax. You have 31% reservation in administration and education. You um, you can make decisions on education. You can levy taxes. You can make decisions on healthcare. There's a lot of power these hill councils have. The problem is, again, because there might be a lot of tribes and sub tribes. Like I said, the sub tribe of the Kukis, Paitis, there was a huge clash between the Kukis and the Paitis as well, right, in 1997. Because there isn't some amount of unified voice between them, a lot of decisions in these hill councils can't be taken. So there isn't a unified voice from any side. Even if you see the Meitei side, there isn't one unified voice asking for one thing. So the deliberations, dialogue become very difficult. Number two, the role of CSOs, civil society organizations. There are dime a dozen. There are so many civil society organizations that it is actually difficult to keep track of them. And you don't know who is supporting whom, who is where, who is being funded by what. They make radical statements of their own volition. Now, all this adds to the confusion. Now, the state government has 34,000 troops in Manipur. Yet, it is so sensitive that it is very difficult to control any of these groups. This is the kind of military experience that we are having in Manipur at this point, because everybody decides that one organization can take this one on, the other organization can take that one on. Individuals can take each other on, and now they are armed. And how do you go against women or children? One, how do you go against your own civilian society becomes a problem, because that civilian is representing a community, so it will enrage the community as well. So I don't think, of course it is our democratic right to criticize and look at it very critically, but if I was to look at it from a very logical point of view, I would say that you can't envy the position that they are in. Yes, when it comes to the fact, I must agree that before the scheduled tribe inclusion thing happened at the High Court, tensions had been building up, and I this might have been the trigger, but things had been happening. So apparently, it is also said that 38 villages from protected forest areas had been removed by the chief minister and his administration without any dialogue. So this became a bone of contention. And then subsequently, other little things started happening because there was a crackdown against poppy cultivation and illegal infiltration. And there wasn't the right sort of communication. So, of course, this is a bit of a problem. But nobody is surrendering arms. Nobody is coming on the drawing board. Out of all the CSOs that we don't have one civil society organization that is made up of Kukis and Meiteis saying that we are willing to at least have a dialogue. So if your civil society is not on board, then in areas like this it becomes very difficult to come to some sort of a conclusion. In the same way, it is very, very difficult to stop drug trafficking, or it's very difficult to stop infiltration if you don't have civil society on board. Because how are you going to stop? There have been so many cases where it's the local villagers. There have been like cases of examples of Kachin women who have given information to forces of unknown people entering the borders. So this is the kind of effort in a situation like this that we'll need. We can't leave it wholly and solely. Of course, we have expectations of the government, we have expectations of the state government, but again, we are a democratically elected government. Now you see, everybody wanted the chief minister's resignation after Rahul Gandhi's ill-advised trip. I don't know why he went to Manipur. He's not a great researcher, he's not a great field worker. What was he going to do there, and that also at such a sensitive time? What happened? There were late night protests. In response to that, what did the chief minister get? He got a huge show of strength. So everybody was expecting, if you remember, for him to go to the governor's house to deliver his resignation, and it was backtracked because there was this huge show of strength. So all these dynamics play a role, but I have always held that civil society will have to play a major role in this conflict, maybe tapering down, but also tomorrow all these fault lines that have been created, these divides that have been created, to bridge them. Because eventually the cookies and Meiteis have to live together, their kids have to go to school together, their women have to work together. It'll have to be a role of the civil society alongside the forces.
Interesting, because as far as this conflict is concerned, even on the role of civil society, NGOs in India, a lot of time this thing is being made about that. Oh, India has a mammoth number of 2 million non-profit organizations. It's not as large as people make it out to be. It is one NGO for every 600 odd people in India. If you compare it with the United States of America, the United States of America has approximately 1.5 million nonprofits for a population of 313 million. So that's like 209. It's like three times of India if you look at the per capita basis. So I don't know why people make it out as if NGOs are like France. Obviously, people we non-profits. I think France is 66, UK is 72 or 73, Italy is 200, US is 209, India 600. Guess what? China is 3,000. They don't have any non-profit organizations. That says a lot about China, doesn't it? uh, yeah,
Of course, it
so
does. We've all known the role of non-profit organizations in India, even in the Northeast. It's very well known. The kind of money that's collected, where it's dispersed, what it's dispersed for. Um, so of course that more often than not they're agenda driven, and which makes it very dangerous in a complex area like the Northeast.
I had a follow-up question on this non-profit thing too. How much of a role, dirty role, have certain non-profits played in fostering these ethnic lines, religious lines, um, as the famous term made famous by Rajiv Malhotra, the breaking India forces. Look, there is enough data out there. I'm not saying all NGOs. I'm not silly to make that statement. There are certain NGOs that play a very dirty role. In some cases, these NGOs are also associated with the church in many ways. We know what happened during the Kudankulam protests. If you remember what happened during the nuclear plant protests, everybody knows what was happening. And everybody just sits there and wonders, oh, what is happening? Nothing is happening. So, so what role have the NGOs played in, these conflicts in the northeastern region?
They played such a huge role, especially missionary-led NGOs,
Yes.
missionary-led organizations. Um, Let me give you the example of the Nagas. What is their demand? The Naga demand is not of a separate state; it's of a separate country, right? What is the flag? What is the slogan? It is Nagalim for Christ. They want a Christian country. Now, how did they get converted?
How secular of them.
How secular of them, of course, Uh, but, for them, they don't even claim to be. So it's very clear it's Nagaland for Christ. Of course, I'm talking about, it's certainly not at its peak, and I think the younger generation has realized that this sort of indulging in these sort of dreams are never going to happen. It's like, unfortunately for the Kuki organizations also, they, thank God, don't want a separate country, but they wanted a Kuki land, a separate state. That sort of territorial compromise is also never going to happen. The government of India has made it very, very, very clear without any uh, ambiguity. And I don't think the people of the Northeast or the other tribes in um, Manipur will tolerate it either. Unfortunately, so you can want whatever you want to, but it's not going to happen. So the same way, I think it's dawned on Nagaland that it's better to be a part of the development bandwagon than it is to be a part of insurgency. There were times when I used to go there, and people would tell me about why they can't run their businesses because there wasn't one extortion group. Because splinter groups are formed, there used to be multiple extortion groups. So on a monthly basis, they were paying taxes to multiple different groups. But that is obviously, that is a thing of the past. There's a great amount of normalcy that's come in. But again, the question comes down to how were these missionaries gaining this sort of entry into these areas? Who was funding them? You need a lot of money to travel in these areas, and in those days you would have needed more money to travel because connectivity wasn't as easy as it is today. Who was funding them? How did they have the money? How did they stay on for years? These are all areas that are riddled with missionary schools. They have so many NGOs. um, all these NGOs are also run by people of people with this inclination towards missionary activities. It was very evident. Like, you didn't need to really think about it. In Jawaharlal Nehru's time, Jawaharlal Nehru, actually maybe one of the only good things that he did in the Northeast was he expelled Reverend Michael Scott. Reverend Michael Scott was caught. He was negotiating between the Nagas and the government of India. He was chosen to negotiate amongst other people. Except he was also found. Trying to negotiate with the Chinese to get their support, so that he could negotiate with the government of India. He was expelled by Nehru because of anti-national activities. Uh, it was also said that weapons were being brought and it's a very famous missionary sort of NGO. Weapons were being brought in boxes that were marked with this NGO to
Mm,
arm the Naga insurgency. So
mm.
the connectivity of these kind of organizations and their role in promoting this sort of insurgency is nothing new. Um, I mean, it was almost like they shared these states. So, like, Nagaland became this thing, Baptist, one state became Presbyterian. But what you'll find very strange is the Anglicans didn't play a huge role because
They didn't.
the Anglicans were so scared that they'd get so much of flack back home that they gave it to these guys. But also, these guys came with more money. So, some of the establishments that you see, Kushal, are in like really remote areas, and you see the kind of land that they've amassed. You see the kind of facilities that they have. There's clearly somebody pumping in a lot of money in these areas, and I think that is not lost on anybody, and that is not lost on the people of the Northeast either.
Yeah, I think the Vidya Bharati schools now coming up all over the Northeast, I think they have lent it a certain level of balance to the state of affairs over there. Like, I don't think people realize that the Sangh as an organization has its highest cadre in the Northeast and in Kerala.
But
These two states.
I've traveled because I had the opportunity to travel these areas when they were very conflict ridden, and then I have had a opportunity to measure it over a period of 15 years. Um, One of the organizations that I found that did some of the most phenomenal work, and this is in the hotspots of insurgency. So these could be in Changlang and Tirap, in the Northeast, where there used to be a lot of NSCN activity going on there, or in Haflong, where we used to have DHD, another insurgent group. You would always find Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram schools. And Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram schools, the whole setup of it is so impressive, so impressive. I remember going to Haflong, and these were the days you didn't have, mobile phone connectivity wasn't available all over. So BSNL would work, but Airtel Vodafone wouldn't work. So you had to go to like an STD and call and whatnot. There was obviously no place to stay. You could not stay anywhere. So if you might stay at a villager's house or something. Or then I found, a Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram school there, and I could stay there. And these were very basic schools, but very clean, very good. But they were hostels. And the reason that they were hostels is because some of the tribal communities came from, such remote places that would take them 2 days to walk back and forth. So what they did, and they also realized that, once they went back, they'd go back for a longer period of time because it was so far to go, that they would have 2 year tenures. And the parents, of course, could come and meet them and all of that. But they'd get to go back home after 2 years. Every 2 years, they could go back. These schools were so wonderful. They were run by people who did the service for free. So there was a State Bank of India bank manager. This lady had retired and come to give 2 years of her life as the principal of this school. I mean, for a lady in her late 50s to come to a place like this, leaving her family, her home, her comfortable environment during her retirement to offer her services for the welfare of tribal communities was to me an exceptional display of character. And I think these are the organizations, these are the people who have not only taken the threats in some of the worst times, but have also established a counter narrative, which would have been wiped out if we had left it the way we had to all these foreign organizations with foreign interests.
I agree, and people don't realize the amount of. There is a difference between how the Sangh functions in these areas and the church functions in these areas. The Sangh inculturates in a very different way. Like people don't realize. I have met personal s- pracharaks in my capacity over the years who have been stationed in the northeast, and they say that yes, we're not beef eaters. But when we go to the northeast, we don't impose our views, and there are stories of individual pracharaks who um,
Yeah, absolutely, Kushal.
who have
Whenever
consumed beef because that's the required job profile, and they will consume beef.
Well, I have seen them in the remotest of areas, no matter where I could have gone, what I could have done. There were schools like this, organizations like this, people like this. We lost a lot of people in the Northeast as well during militancy. Even when I used to go there, it wasn't considered safe, and this was when there was relative peace. I'm talking about 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. But we've had people be there in the 80s, which was the peak of insurgency, and shot dead point blank. So obviously, there's a lot that is to be owed to them. But also, yes, the important point that you made is I have never seen anybody, any of these organizations trying to enforce any of their own
And they don't.
beliefs, whether it's social, religious, or political, on any of these communities.
They never
On the
would.
contrary, very much in line with what Gurya said, is uh, the question is not of establishing a common religion or common practices. The question is of reminding them of their authentic identity, which, due to this kind of activity, they had forgotten. And the minute they start doing that, automatically, because again, these are old civilizational connects, the integration begins to happen because there is so much of common ground. In a lot of remote tribes, you will find Pitrapaksh, you will find a Gram Devta, You will find people doing Bhumi Pujan. You will find people associating the symbolism of a snake to Shivji. You will even find Mahabharata or Ramayan written from their own point of view in terms of from the point of view of Valli. So there's one of it that is written from the point of view of Valli. Nobody is trying to impose anything, but the fact is the virtue in this is that you have a more integrated society, and it's not one over the other, but it's just rediscovering your roots that tie you to each other.
Exactly, and that is the Indian way. That is the way of dharma. That is the way where even a person like me, who is an unabashed Charvak, who doesn't hide his disbelief, is still considered a part of a society and equal stakeholder of the society. So, Rami, I know that we are almost an hour and a half in the chat. So, before we wrap things up, are there any last parting words that you want to make? I'll hand it over to you now.
Well, I think we've discussed a whole array of things. There really isn't a lot that I have to say, except the fact that I think, this conflict has become now too prolonged, and it has huge amount of emotional impacts. It has a huge amount of security impacts that we are going to have to deal with for a really long time. Um, I hope that both the communities can come to the drawing table, but with the understanding that they'll have to cede some space, and they'll have to understand the historical foundations of some claims, as well as, so if the Meiteis say that we have historical claims, which is in all of the census records um, from the British time, um, cookies have their own problems in terms of the hill areas are not developed enough. We don't get enough of the budget there. So these are all things that have to be addressed, with the understanding that, these communities have to live together, because there is going to be no territorial reorganization of the state. This is what we need to understand. And so we have a limited framework to work with, and within that, we will have to come to a conclusion.
Fair enough. I hope this conflict is resolved as quickly as possible. At the end of the day, these are all Indian citizens, whether we like it or not, and nobody who's a citizen of India should suffer. And the law of the land should reign in supreme. And I'm personally very much in favor of the STC status for the Métis, because they deserve it. If they are oppressed, if a community is oppressed, then they should get the benefits of that.
Yeah, but can I add something, Kushal? This ST status thing also that we keep talking about, nobody knows what it means. If who constitutes a scheduled tribe? There was a local committee report which gave it characteristics, which meant shyness of contact, isolated geographically, certain special customs, rituals. If we were really to look at it, majority of those communities who are in scheduled tribe list today would not meet those criteria, apart from really the tribes in Andaman and Nicobar or whatever. So I think it's important to also see things in present time perspective,
Yeah,
instead
but
of
in at that time, basically, it was the Avarnas who were given the SC/ST status. The
um,
Avarnas, people who were not in any Varna.
no, but this is what I am quoting is a 1970s report of the local committee, because before that there weren't any stipulations of what a tribe should be. Post independence, this is one of the major landmark committee reports that came,
Yeah,
which
I am aware of this 1970s report.
so this gave characteristics, and one of the most important characteristics was shyness of contact, isolation of geography. So I think if
So
sorry.
all introverts can claim ST status.
Correct. So so I think all these new things, these hardened views need to be softened a little bit, and one needs to understand you can debate anything either way, keeping in the context in mind.
Fair enough. I see where you're coming from, and I remember reading that 1970 report. It was kind of silly. I just when I was like they were trying to define it, I was like, you guys are stupid. But then in India, everything that is decided in these ways. I mean, I mean, as a person who leans libertarian on many issues, I'm very sympathetic to SC/ST reservation for multiple reasons. I've done podcasts explaining that from a historical perspective also, and from a legal perspective. But yeah, it is what it is. But I hope this issue gets resolved. But Rami, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was a
Not
pleasure
at all.
talking to you, and hopefully we will have many more such conversations.
Thank you very much for having me, and it was a pleasure being here. Thank you.
All right, guys, you can once again, this is for everyone, whether you're an audio listener or watching this on YouTube. In the description of the podcast, you will see Rami's Twitter handle and the link to her YouTube channel. So you can go and subscribe to her YouTube channel too. And you can follow her on social media. As far as I'm concerned, you know the drill. If you want to support the Cārvāka podcast, first you can start by subscribing to this channel, liking this video, and leaving a comment in the comment section. Then you can, if you want to go to the next step, you can buy the merchandise on kushalmehra.com or on Kadak Merch, or you can support this by becoming a member. As you know, this is a member driven podcast. I don't do ad reads. I have stayed away from ad reads. I do get offers, I don't do them. And you can become a member on YouTube, Patreon, Fanvo, wherever you are, or you can send your donations to UPI. I will see you guys next time. Until then, take care. Bye.